My name is Amy Janess. I'm the programming coordinator at the Atheneum. And Janet, who just disappeared, is also with us tonight on the call. And it is my pleasure to welcome you tonight on behalf of both the Atheneum and the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. You're in for a treat. Seth, who is the Naturalist, Educator, and Program Manager at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, is going to talk about some grassland projects he's been working on. And as you go along, if you have a question, I encourage you to write it out in the Q&A. You'll see the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Just click in there and put your question. Or at the end, you're also welcome to put your questions in there. And then when Seth is finished, we'll go through them and answer them and hopefully have a great discussion. So that's it for me. I'm going to pop out and I give you Seth.
Sounds good. I'm just going to share my screen here. Good evening, everybody. As Amy said, my name is Seth Engelbourg. I'm the Naturalist, Educator, and Program Manager at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. And I would first like to start by thanking the Nantucket Atheneum for providing us a platform to do this virtual lecture, and for all the participants for getting on today and listening virtually. I know a lot of the names that have popped up in the chat, so unfortunately, we're not able to see each other in person, but it's great to see you virtually. The topic of today's program is going to be grassland restoration and its benefits for birds. And just before I start, I want to mention that I will be going over this program today, but this is a program that's ongoing at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation that is a cooperative effort among all of our staff, myself, Dr. Sarah Boyce, the LLNF Director of Research and Education, and it's also involved our interns and volunteers in the past. So with that, we'll get started. So before we get into the issue of what actually we're doing in the project that's going to be referenced, I want to start with what the issue is. And some of you on the call may have heard about this paper. It's a pretty famous article that came out in the journal Science last year in 2019. So there's two figures represented here on the screen. The first one on the left is a graphical depiction of how bird populations have been changing over time. And this is an estimate of all wild bird counts in North America since the 1970s. And what we're seeing is a pretty drastic decline in pretty much every group of birds. Pretty much every group of birds across the board, except for waterfowl, which I'll explain in 1 second. But these numbers are quite significant. We see, 20 plus to 30+% decrease in a lot of these types of birds. There are two sort of beneficial pieces of data that have come out of this study. One is that introduced species are actually down quite a bit. That's actually a good thing because introduced species, non-native species, or possibly invasive species take up habitat and resources for the native species. So having less of them in the environment is beneficial. And then all the way on the right, we see an increase in waterfowl. And it's good that we're seeing more waterfowl over the course of the study, but really there's just a few specific pieces of legislation and efforts that are driving that, especially the Clean Water Act, which was passed after the 1970s, and also locally the Massachusetts Wetland Protection Act placed an added emphasis on the protection of wetland areas that didn't really affect some of these other species, or it might have helped water birds a bit, but not land birds or shorebirds. And also there have been targeted conservation measures led by hunting groups like Ducks Unlimited, raising money to really support waterfowl. So that's probably why we're seeing an increase in those species, but a decrease in pretty much all birds other than waterfowl across the board. And then the most drastic decrease that we're seeing, or one of the most drastic decreases that we're seeing, is going to be the topic of discussion tonight, and that's grassland birds. And we're seeing an absolutely crushing, huge decline in the population of these birds since 1970, and over 50%, so more than half of the total grassland birds in North America since 1970 are estimated to have been lost. And this species, which is shown on screen, this charismatic yellow bird, is an eastern meadowlark. It's estimated that 3 in 4 of those have been lost since 1970. That's a species that used to be regularly observed on Nantucket, and now it's pretty difficult to find one. They are still reported every now and then, but not nearly in the numbers that they used to be. So that's the issue. And this might be a little bit rudimentary, but I want to make sure we all have a very clear definition of what grassland birds actually mean. So grassland birds are just birds that rely on grasslands for nesting or other life functions. Those functions include foraging or finding cover. There are some birds that may benefit from grasslands, but aren't reliant on grasslands to undergo their main life strategies. Those are just land birds. They're not grassland dependent birds. And for the purpose of this presentation, we're really focusing on birds that need grasslands in order to survive. And if grasslands are lost, these birds will cease to exist. The bird pictured here is a bobolink. It's a very beautiful bird. It's a charismatic bird that is often referenced as being an indicator species for grassland birds. And that's a conservation target for many grassland restoration projects. So why do we even care about any of this? Other than the fact that the numbers I presented are shocking and startling, we care as conservation scientists because we need to know essentially 3 things. We need to know for the species that we care about, in this case it's grassland birds, what is the overall status of their population throughout their whole range. So in their wintering grounds or summering grounds, migration, everywhere that they exist, what is their population experiencing? Is it experiencing an increase, a decrease, or is it stable? And then we also need to know, are local populations experiencing the same trend as generally across North America, or are they experiencing something different? And finally, we need to know, this sort of relates to number 2, but we need to know, especially if local populations are experiencing different trends than the overall population, we need to know, are there concrete conservation actions that we can take in our local area to help support those populations of grassland birds? So here are some examples of conservation actions that help birds. I broke these down into individual actions and organizational actions. Individual actions can be anything like planting natives in your yard, adding window decals to prevent bird strikes, making sure your cats stay indoors so that they're not eating wild birds, providing bird feeders, reducing plastic consumption, things like that. And then there are actions that can only really be undertaken at the organizational level. The topic of today's project is going to be ecological restoration and population monitoring, but there are other actions that can be taken by organizations such as wildlife rehab, providing a robust network of bird feeders and nest boxes, and crucially, purchasing and protecting open space. We're pretty good at this on Nantucket. It's estimated that about 50 or even more than 50% of the island is in permanent conservation, but elsewhere off island, this isn't always the case. So it's great to restore habitats and restore ecosystems, but one of the things we can do before we get to that level is also try to protect ecosystems that are functioning already as intended. So what is ecological restoration? It's a pretty simple concept with a very complex set of actions that undergo that are associated with restoration projects. So essentially, ecological restoration is taking a degraded habitat or ecosystem and renewing and restoring it through some type of active human intervention. So it has to be something that humans are doing. There are examples where over time, habitats might restore naturally, but this really focuses on humans intervening in the environment by doing some physical action to restore a habitat to a non-degraded state. And the purpose of this is when you restore the habitat that any type of wildlife needs. So when you bring back the nesting sites, the food, and the cover for those animals, it allows those animals to recruit back into the area, to have appropriate plants and habitats to perform their life strategies, and hopefully to restore their populations. And there are many ways where habitats can get degraded. It can be due to pollution, development, all sorts of things. But one of the examples that we're going to talk about in this case is due to the encroachment of invasive species. So quickly, just making sure we all understand what an invasive species is. Simply, it's an organism that is causing some type of economic, ecological, or human health harm in an area where it's non-native. These are two plants that are pretty bad invasives on Nantucket. And for the rest of the project, we're going to be talking about specifically one invasive species, Japanese black pine. This is the target of restoration work that is ongoing at the foundation, and also is key to the grant-funded project that I'll be discussing later in this presentation. That's the grant we received in 2020 through the Robert F. Schumann Foundation, which is sort of the crux of this presentation as a whole. But getting back to Japanese black pine, that's a non-native tree. It's an invasive tree that was brought to Nantucket originally on purpose. It was brought here for use as a windbreak and for soil stabilization. On Nantucket, we have kind of this coastal ecosystem with these low-growing grassland and shrublands and huge amounts of wind and salt spray. And there isn't a lot to protect homes or farms or properties from the wind. So these black pines were brought here because they can very quickly grow. They have an extensive root system, and they are able to provide those effects as a windbreak and to stabilize the soil. Unfortunately, whenever you bring a non-native species into an ecosystem, there's a potential that it may become invasive and cause harm that was unintended. And in this case, that's definitely what happened. This species spreads rapidly and takes up habitat area of native species, particularly grassland and heathland species. For anyone who's walked in the pine forest before, you may know that, the trees drop a lot of needles and pine cones and kind of create a thick needle layer on the ground, which blocks the soil, and it prevents whatever's in the seed bank from regrowing or popping back up. And also, these trees, which grow taller than a lot of our native species, crowd out the canopy and prevent sunlight from penetrating down into the lower canopy, which would allow our native grasses and forbs and even shrubs to grow. And the unfortunate issue with this species specifically is it's subject to this pine blight, which causes it to die off at a rapid rate. You can see on the picture on the right, here's a stand of Japanese black pine that was at our property. Most of the trees in this picture are actually dead. They, as I said before, grow quite fast. They can grow to sort of a mature size in maybe as little as 10 to 30 years, but then they also die off due to this blight. And because of their pretty extensive root structure, they might stand dead for another 10 or 30 years until a storm or something else knocks them over. unless they're actively removed by humans. And at that point, we just have a lot of standing dead wood that's not providing a lot of habitat value to the ecosystem. There is some reasons why you want dead snags and dead woods in the ecosystem to provide resources for insects and decomposers and some other species. But what we don't need is just acres upon acres of dead invasive trees kind of taking up the space where a native grassland or heathland could occur. And this is sort of the only significant invasive plant that we are dealing with at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. We, unlike some of the other properties organizations, don't have a lot of invasive grasses or vines or shrubs in the interior of our property. We have a few issues that are isolated, but this is sort of the main invasive that we deal with. I don't want to say it's easy to deal with. As you'll see in the future slides, it's quite expensive to manage, but it's at least easy to identify. You can see it even from an aerial map. And when you go and ground truth it, you walk up to the tree, you look at the cluster of needles. If the pine has if the cluster has 2 needles on it, it's a Japanese black pine. If it has 3 needles on it, it's our native pitch pine, which is something we want to keep. So it's easy to identify in the field at least, but it's quite expensive to take care of. And sort of over the last few years at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, we've identified that this is an issue and have started on a variety of projects trying to manage and remove this species. So before I get into some of those projects, I just want to show everybody who may be unfamiliar with our property what our property boundary is. So we'll start at the small map. This is Nantucket Island. We're off the coast of Massachusetts, about 30 miles out to sea, in the northeast part of the United States. And this small yellow star at the northwest corner of the map is where our property is located. And then we move to the big map, and the yellow boundary is sort of the entirety of our property. For those who have a longer history of interaction with the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, you may know that through much of our history, we sort of owned only this property on the western end, the left end, which was about 108 acres. But we did, in the past year or so, receive this land to the east, which was previously held privately by Linda Loring, our founder. Unfortunately, she passed away a little over a year ago. And when she died, the rest of her estate, her land, transferred to the foundation. But for the most part, a lot of the projects we're going to talk about today and the Schumann grant, which I'm going to reference later, is occurring on the western side of the property. We are a 275 acre property, or our property is 275 acres, and we operate as a wildlife sanctuary. So there is a conservation restriction on site that prevents certain activities. People aren't allowed to ride bikes on our property. There's no horseback riding on our property. There's no dogs allowed on our property. And those things are all already beneficial for birds, especially ground nesting birds who may be disturbed by those types of activities. So trying to do an ecological restoration project on this site that's already operating as a wildlife sanctuary is a good idea. So going back to some of the past or ongoing management efforts at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, here are some of the projects that we've undertaken so far to try to manage this Japanese black pine. That's the invasive tree I referenced before. We received some money from the state, from Mass Wildlife, some money from a regional pollinator network. And then this is the project we'll be talking about for the rest of the presentation. It's a $51,000 grant from the Schumann Foundation that we received just this year in 2020 and will be ongoing. And I'll show you a map of some of the areas where pine management has already been undertaken. The first place we started was here. This is our office right here. So we started kind of reducing a pine stand right next to the office. And then phase 2 was out here to the western end of our property, 3 and 4 there as well. And the Schumann Foundation grant phase is going to be phase 5. That's not on this map, but you'll see a map of the project areas later when we talk more about that. All of these projects have been grant funded so far, and at 110 Eel Point Road, about a total of 10 acres of this invasive Japanese black pine have been removed. We also have done a little bit of pine management at 90 Eel Point Road. That's the property that we gained ownership of more recently. And that just started in the late winter of 2019 and the early winter and spring of 2020. And at that parcel, we've removed about 3 to 4 acres of the invasive Japanese black pine to date. You can see on this aerial map all those areas of trees that look like pine trees, in fact, are more pine trees. Those are Japanese black pines as well. We do plan to remove those at some point, but we're running into one issue here is that there are wetlands, a lot of wetlands on this site, and these pine trees fall within the 100-foot buffer to those wetlands. So in order to do more management in those areas, we'll need to go to the Nantucket Conservation Commission and file a notice of intent to receive permission to remove trees in those areas. So total across 90 Eel Point Road and 110 Eel Point Road, so far to date of past and ongoing pine management projects, I would say we've done close to 15 acres of removal of that tree. So here's what the management actually looks like. This is a scene from Eel Point Road, and these trees all in the back here are the Japanese black pine. Also some of these smaller ones are Japanese black pines as well. When I say management, what we really mean is we engage a landscape contractor to come in and cut, chip, and remove all of the tree and the woody material from the site. And after we do that, it looks like this. So this is the scene. This is the same exact location, maybe a little bit to the right, but you can see that the two sign markers are approximately in the same location in both photos. And in this picture, all the pines have been removed. I understand that this might be a sort of shocking or startling picture because it looks like everything is dead and it's just barren, open ground. But this first picture was taken in the summer in the growing season, and this post-management picture was taken in the dormant season in the winter. And in the subsequent growing season, after this management activity was taking place, all the area here where you see just dead stumps now and bare grounds, that all filled back in with the native grass and wildflower and shrub species that we were expecting to come back. So with that, we get into finally the project at hand. And this is the Robert F. Schumann Foundation grant that we received in 2020. And we received $51,000 from that grant funder to improve habitat for grassland birds through 3 very specific steps. The first is invasive species management, and that is the removal of the Japanese black pine. That is similar to what's happened in all the other projects we've already undertaken at the site. The second, which is connected, is the ecological restoration of sandplain grassland. Sampling grassland is characterized by the Massachusetts Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program as being critically imperiled. It's a globally rare habitat. It's thought that as much as 90% of that habitat may occur on Nantucket alone. And when I say ecological restoration, if you remember from before, when we talk about restoration, we need to identify an ecosystem that's degraded and what has degraded it. So in this case, the degradation occurred from this invasive Japanese black pine encroaching on the area that had historically been sandplain grassland and taking up the habitat space for those native species. And then we have to use an active human intervention to aid the restoration process. And in this case, the active intervention is the cutting, chipping, and removing of those Japanese black pines. There may be other projects elsewhere off island or that you might hear about in the news where they take additional steps after that. For instance, we could add native seeds, or we could try to plant species that are characteristic of the sandplain grassland. But in this case, our active intervention is just to cut and remove the invasive Japanese black pines and allow the natural revegetation of the sandplain grassland species that exist in the surrounding area and in the seed bank. And then the most important thing that differentiates this project from some of the past pine management projects we've undertaken in the past is that we're going to be conducting multi-year avian, that means bird, and vegetation monitoring that is going to correspond with these management activities. So all of the management activities we've undertaken in the past, where we've Japanese black pine, we've done some vegetation monitoring with them, and we've seen through that the grassland species have revegetated. But the specific focus of this project that differentiates it from the rest of the projects we've done in the past are that we're looking specifically at whether the result of that revegetation and the result of those grassland species coming back will lead to grassland birds that depend on those plants and depend on that habitat type to also return to the area and to nest there, to forage there, and to find cover there. So in the past, we anecdotally may have been able to say we have done projects that removed Japanese black pine and allowed grassland species to revegetate. That's good for grassland birds. But empirically, we don't know that. And the only way we are going to know that is if we do a targeted monitoring of bird species using those grassland areas. So I'll get a little bit into the monitoring program as we go through these slides. But essentially, what we're doing is we're examining what bird species are using the area before the trees are cut, and then what bird species are using the areas after the trees are cut to evaluate if there's been any change in the types of species we're seeing and the abundance of individuals we're seeing for each species. So the objectives of this project are the following. We're trying to remove those invasive Japanese black pines, open the canopy to allow those sandplain grassland species that are underneath to be able to revegetate. That will expand the habitat available for these grassland birds to come back and use these new habitat areas. And then we also want to involve interns, students, and volunteers in this project, which we've already started to do. At some point when we're further along in this process, we're going to be creating educational signage about how grassland restoration works and how it benefits birds. And then crucially, we want to maintain this habitat as open sandplain grassland in the long term. So if we just cut the pines and don't monitor it at all after, we run the risk of pine material, or let's say pine cones, still being in the seed bank and causing more Japanese black pines to germinate and to start to grow. So we want to make sure that that's not happening. We want to monitor the vegetation that's coming back and try to, for the lifespan of this project and even beyond the lifespan of this project, make sure that the characteristic species moving forward really are indicative of what's found in the sandplain grassland. So the grasses, the wildflowers, and some shrubs as well that would be characteristic of those habitat types. Here's the timeline of this project. It's quite extensive. We started in June of this year, and it's going to go all the way through October of 2023. I apologize, it's a sort of text-heavy, boring slide. But essentially, all we've done so far is conduct the pre-management monitoring. So when I say pre-management monitoring, what I mean is that we have taken the data on the birds and the vegetation that's found in the project areas prior to us cutting any Japanese black pines down. So there's a specific monitoring protocol for the birds and a specific monitoring protocol for the vegetation, which I'll discuss both of later. But when I say pre-management, I mean that we have the data before those trees have been cut. And then after those trees have been cut, in the later years, we'll be doing post-management monitoring. The other thing that we have done so far is taken a pre-management drone-based aerial map. So essentially, we've flown a drone over the project areas and took a bunch of photos and meshed them together using a process called orthomosaic mapping, which will show us, which shows us an aerial view of what the landscape looks like right now, or at least in this past fall, before the trees were cut. And then the next thing we're going to be doing this winter in the next few months is actually working with our landscape contractor to have the trees cut in the project areas. Then we'll be doing another drone survey immediately after that to examine at an aerial view what the landscape looks like right after the trees have been cut. So we'll have a map before the trees have been cut, and then the map after the trees have been cut. And then for the next 3 years, we'll be doing subsequent years of data collection of the birds and the vegetation found in each of the project areas using the same protocol that we did prior to management, prior to removal of the trees. And we'll also be doing the same drone-based aerial mapping. So at the end of the project, we'll have 5 different drone-based maps. We'll have one before any management activities, one immediately post-management, and then 3 in each subsequent year. And that will take us all the way into the fall of 2023, where at that point we'll have more significant data and some preliminary results. And we hope at that point to be able to come back in a platform like this or in a different platform and share our results at that point. So here's a little bit more about the monitoring program. As I mentioned before, there's 3 types of monitoring we're doing. The avian monitoring, that's looking at the birds using project areas, the vegetation monitoring, and the drone-based aerial mapping. And here are the project areas that are being used in this project. The 3 sort of circles over here on the left are our management plots. You can see that there's a blue dot in the center of each of those circles. That's a centroid point that is essentially where the center of the management plot is. And there's a 50-meter orange circle that extends out past that management plot. The 3 management plots are areas where Japanese black pine exists and areas where Japanese black pine will be removed from. And then we also have 1 control plot. That's a plot that is characteristically similar to our management plots. It has Japanese black pine and a similar suite of characteristics to the management plots. But in the control plot, Japanese black pines will not be cut and removed from that plot over the 3-year course of this project. And that will allow us to show not only what the difference in vegetation and avian change is within the 3 management plots, but it'll also allow us to assess over the totality of the management, how is the removal of the Japanese black pines having an effect on the vegetation and the birds in the areas of management versus the control plot, which will not have the pines removed. It will have essentially the same or similar vegetation cover in 3 years as it does now. So how do we do the avian monitoring? We're using a well-established technique called a point count. And I'm going to go back to this slide for a second. In a point count, the surveyor will create a plot by placing a flag. So each of these blue circles represents the center of a point count plot. So place a flag at that dot, GPS that location so it's stored and can be returned to. And then we'll draw using GIS an imaginary 50-foot radius around that centroid point. So you'll be standing at the center of essentially an imaginary circle. And it sort of looks like this. Somebody's standing at the center of this plot. And at that plot, we'll be recording all of the birds that they see or hear in a 5-minute time period. It's very important that that time period is exactly 5 minutes. So we use a timer to make sure we're not going over. And we are recording all the birds we see or hear only within that circle. So if we hear a bird way outside of any of the plots while we're standing in this plot, we don't count it. Only if that bird flies into or is already into the circle when we arrive. As I had mentioned before, we're doing a point count in each of the management plots and also in the control plots. So there are 4 point count circles in total. And we also collected point count data at 4 different dates in 2020, June 18th, June 25th, July 2nd, and July 7th. The reason why we collected multiple dates of data is just to make sure we're not missing any species. Sometimes the weather or environmental factors are different. If you only collect 1 day of data, you might be missing some birds, but if you collect multiple dates of data, you can average across all those dates and making sure you have a more robust analysis of the birds that are actually being found in that specific area. So what we collect for each point count is the weather, the species that are in our point count circle, the number of individuals of each species, and we also recorded the eBird breeding code for each bird. I'll talk when we get to the data more about what that is, but essentially it's a visual or auditory estimation of what types of breeding activities do we think that that bird's engaging in. So there are confirmed activities like feeding young or incubating eggs. And then there are possible or probable activities like if you see a pair in suitable habitat, or you see multiple birds singing in a certain habitat, we're recording what the highest possible breeding code of the birds we see in each point count location is, so that we can get sort of an estimate not only of the species and the number of individuals that we're seeing, but also how are they using our locations. And the reason why we're using the eBird breeding codes rather than something we just made up is because it's a well-established protocol that already exists and has been used in a lot of other projects, so there's a good reference material for it. This table on the right is the specific list of birds that we are hoping to see. So this is a table of 24 species that have been identified by the Massachusetts State Wildlife Action Plan as being of conservation concern in grasslands. These are all species that either are obligate grassland species or are somewhat dependent on grasslands for some aspect of their life history. And our ultimate hope of this project is that after we do the invasive species management and remove all those trees, that the sandplain grassland species come back, and that increase in grassland cover will allow for these 24 bird species to recruit back into the area and start using it again. So in the third year of monitoring, if we find more of these species and in a higher abundance of individuals than we do before we cut down the trees, so prior to management, that would be sort of preliminary evidence that our management activities have been successful in helping recruit those grassland species back into our areas of concern. So here are just a little bit closer up looks of the management plots. This background map that we're seeing is the drone aerial that was taken. These are the management plots and the point count radii. This is the control plot and the radius around it. So again, during the point count, the observer is standing at this blue circle and counting all the birds that they see within this imaginary or orange area. And here's what we know so far. This is definitely obviously preliminary because we only have one season of data and it is only the pre-management data, not any data. We don't have any data that's been taken after the trees have been cut because that activity hasn't happened yet. But we know from our point counts that of the table I referenced before here, this 24 species of bird that we're hoping to be able to recruit back into our grasslands, currently we only observed 2 of them. We observed an eastern towhee, that's this gorgeous fallow on the right, and we reported a northern harrier. The towhee reports, we found 10 in our control plot, 10 in our management plot 1, 6 in our management plot 2, and 15 in our management plot 3. And the highest breeding code that we found for towhees, so how they were using the area, is an M that stands for multiple. It really means that there is 7 or more singing birds present in one of these areas. And then northern harriers, that's the other species on the list that we reported prior to management activities. We found many fewer of them, only 1 in our control plot, 3 in the first management plot, 2 in the second management plot, and 3 in the third management plot. But interestingly enough, we found a higher breeding code. We found the code P, which stands for pair in suitable habitat. So in one of these plots on one of the dates, I actually observed a male and a female flying together and landing in our point count location and engaging in the courtship display. So that sort of sums up what we know so far related to the avian monitoring. And then the other thing we're doing is vegetation monitoring. In the vegetation monitoring, there's a different protocol. So instead of a point count, what we are doing is something called a transect. I'll explain that in a bit in the next few slides. And also just taking some pre and post restoration photos of areas that before they were cut and then after they are going to be cut. So here's what transects look like. So that these orange circles are the same areas as the point count locations. But instead of having just a singular point in the center of the circle where the observer is standing at and listening to or seeing birds, in this type of monitoring, we actually have these lines, these transects that are laid out across the ground. And what the surveyor does is actually walk along these lines, and at specific points along the lines is recording the coverage of different species found. So they're looking at the ground, they're looking at what types of plants are on the ground. So they're trying to see, okay, this percent is covered by pine, this percent is covered by grass, by shrub, etc. And they're actually doing it all the way down to the species level so that they know not only what type of coverage is on the ground, but what species is occupying that part of the ground. This part of the monitoring I have not been involved with. This is being done by Sarah Boyce and our intern. I was the one who was associated with doing the bird monitoring part of this project. So that's what it looks like in the management plots. And then these are the transects in the control plot. Same thing, someone's walking across this line and recording along the line the type of vegetation that's found alongside that transect. So here's what we know for preliminary vegetation. This is the cover for all of the management plots in total. And we're going to start with pine. So almost 40% of the coverage of the transect area was made up of pine. And also there was quite a bit of other woody species, mainly things like huckleberry, which is a dominant shrub on Nantucket in general, but especially in the Linda Loring Nature Foundation landscape. But interestingly and extremely important are these other two bars. Gram stands for graminoids or grasses, and forb stands for herbaceous plants that are not grass-like. And the good thing about these two numbers, especially with graminoids, the grasses, is that there's a significant amount of them under the pine canopy. So when we remove the coverage of pine and hopefully bring this from almost 40 down to 0, there will be adequate space for these graminoids and forbs to grow back in and revegetate. They'll be able to spread, and also presumably there'll be suitable seed material of those species in the seed bank to resprout and take up the area that was previously occupied by pines. So our hope for restoration is that that process occurs naturally. And because there's a significant amount of those species in the area, that's why we think that we won't have to do anything like seed addition or planting plants. We'll just let the species that are already there, we'll open up the canopy and the coverage of area, land area available to them, and they will be able to grow back in naturally. The purpose of the vegetation monitoring is to see over the next 3 years if that in fact does happen. But from some of the other projects that we have done so far at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, the earlier projects that I referenced before at the beginning of this presentation, we have seen that in fact when we do remove the pines in areas where these other graminoids and forbs are existing in the seed bank and under the canopy, they've been able to come back and revegetate the areas, turning what was formerly an invasive Japanese black pine woodland back into a native grassland ecosystem. And then finally, I talked about this already a bit before, but we're just doing aerial surveying. The purpose of that is to look kind of at a larger level landscape scale and ultimately see from an aerial view or from a GIS view what the landscape looks like in reference to change over time. So we're going to be doing 5 different mapping dates, pre-management. That's already been done. Here's one of the orthomosaics from that. Here's me taking the survey. Here's the drone we use, DJI Inspire 2. As I mentioned before, we'll be doing the same mapping process right after management, and hopefully we'll be able to see the map without any of the pines in it, showing the immediate change to the coverage across the landscape. And then once each year, so that ultimately we can take all those maps, 5 maps in total, and mesh them together to try to get a fine scale aerial view of what the landscape looks like or how it's changing over time, kind of at a broad level. The avian monitoring and the vegetation monitoring is kind of very hands-on on the ground. This is kind of at a larger landscape scale, what are we seeing in terms of changes to the overall landscape? So here are the next steps. We have scheduled the Japanese black pine removal. So that's actually the management part of our project. That's scheduled for early this winter. And then we'll be doing the post-management drone survey to get that map. And then we'll be doing the 3 years of subsequent bird and vegetation monitoring to try to really assess if removing all of these Japanese black pines is doing what we think it should be doing and what it's intended to do. That's to return the landscape to a sampling grassland by allowing those grassland species area to revegetate in and opening up the canopy to allow light penetration for those species. And then by doing that and increasing the grassland coverage on our site, assessing whether that actually has the effect of not only restoring the plants and the habitat related to the plants, but also whether it allows the birds, the grassland birds that rely on those plants and those habitats to come back and start to use those areas again and nest there, feed there, and find cover there, and hopefully continue to use those areas in the long term, which will lead to ultimately an improvement in an increase in those populations. So with that, I thank you very much. If anyone has thoughts or questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And if anything was confusing, I apologize. So feel free to ask away and point out any questions that you have in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. I'll give you a minute to catch your breath and maybe take a drink of water, but we do have a couple. If you want.
Is that helpful or?
Well, then they have to look at us.
Okay, I'll stay like this.
So let's see. There's a question that says, do you have to remove the root systems of the Japanese black pine?
Yeah, so we, in the projects that have already we've already undertaken them at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, have not removed the root systems. For most of the projects, we've kind of just cut the stumps and chipped up all the material and left the rest of the stump there. There's a few instances where we actually tried to remove some of the stumps, but mostly we just cut the trunk of the tree and removed it, and that's been sufficient in harming the tree enough where it doesn't have the resources to reproduce or survive after that.
Okay, thank you. Please explain the difference between Japanese black pine and pitch pine.
Sure. I mean, I think that from a taxonomic perspective, obviously there's differences. The main difference between those two species is that pitch pine is native. It historically has grown here on Nantucket and has been part of the local ecosystem. Japanese black pine on the other hand, was brought here. It's an introduced non-native invasive species that isn't dealing with natural predators or competition because it's in a new environment. And that's what has allowed it to spread so rapidly and cause unintended effects. Japanese black pine also is much more subject to that pine blight that I mentioned than the pitch pine. So it's more likely to die and stand dead than the pitch pines.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question from Andrew. Do you foresee immediate and artificial effects of tree removal on bird species? For example, rodents using the cleared area before other vegetation grows in and attracting raptors.
Thank you, Andrew. I hadn't really thought about that. I think that it's a salient observation. Whenever you have sort of a highly disturbed area, there are species that will try to take advantage of that. You get early successional plants coming in, and definitely things like rodents might be using those areas more. So raptors might be able to feed in those areas. But really the focus of this project is not on the short-term effects, but it's on the long-term effects over the 3-year or even more past the end of this project, past its functional lifespan. Looking into the future, it's really about changing the habitat from that invasive Japanese black pine woodland to the native sandpine grassland, and hopefully allowing a fully functioning ecosystem to return that will be beneficial to the grassland birds that depend on it.
Okay, great. And Stuart has 2 questions. The first one is, are you foreseeing bird species migrating to Nantucket from elsewhere with improved grassland restoration?
Sure. I mean, bird species already do migrate to Nantucket from elsewhere. Some of the species that we care about are highly migratory species that historically existed on Nantucket. Things like eastern meadowlark, short-eared owls, things like that. So these species already might be migrating over Nantucket or flying past Nantucket, or might even be stopping on Nantucket, but then are continuing on their journey because of lack of appropriate habitat. So when we create new habitat over time, the intention is that those birds will start to come back and use that habitat.
Okay. And the second question is, can you share any new technologies that are coming down the pike to improve conservation efforts?
Yeah, I mean, that one's a kind of a stumper, but I think that definitely drone-based technologies, the capacity to do real-time on-demand mapping at a much higher resolution than you would be able to access with traditional GPS satellite imagery is really effective for conservation, because we can tell at a much better resolution what the exact conditions on site look like at an aerial level, rather than relying on a fuzzy, possibly outdated satellite photograph.
Okay. And then Susan wants to know, is there a negative environmental impact in cutting down the Japanese pines?
We don't expect that there will be, particularly because there are pitch pines, the native pitch pine, that also occur on site at our property, and we are not removing those species. So we know some of the people on this talk might have listened to Daniel Odell's talk earlier in the season about bats. We know that on Nantucket, bats are using pine trees for roosting sites. So there's potentially an impact of removing a lot of pine coverage from an area to bats, and possibly to insects and other things that rely on those trees. But we're we're never removing the pitch pine, and we're doing this sort of piece by piece. So we're not going across our whole property and at one time removing all the Japanese black pines from the whole property. We're doing it in project area by project area. So there are still Japanese black pines on our property in addition to the pitch pines, and the species that require those resources can move elsewhere.
Okay. And then there's a question about how the Japanese pine spreads. Does it spread through seeds, and how are they dispersed?
Yeah, Japanese black pine, it puts out pine cones, and they regenerate or they germinate from those pine cones. They are quite effective at germinating, and they sort of grow in these big, almost colonial areas, big stands, and over time, if left unchecked, will create large stands, almost predominantly consisting of only pine with not much else underneath. So as the problem, or as these trees grow up and as the problem is left unchecked, it becomes more and more of an issue. It's good to do something about it now rather than continuing to wait into the future.
Okay, great. Well, I think we've come to the end of the questions. If you have one, now is the time to put it in the Q&A in the chat. Seth, is there any final words you want to leave us with?
Nope, just I look forward to coming back in a few years or presenting on an alternate type of platform about the progress of this project. And anyone who's interested, you're welcome to reach out to me via email. You can find my contact information on our organizational website. That's LLNF.org. If you have any other questions about this project or about the work that the Linda Loring Nature Foundation does in general, I'm always happy to be in touch. So I want to again thank the Nantucket Atheneum for offering us the platform to share this presentation. And I would like to thank everybody who joined the webinar for being an active audience.
Excellent. Well, thank you for bringing your research to this virtual meeting, for lack of a better word. And I think that'll do it. We'll wrap it up and leave it here. We have recorded the presentation. It'll be on our YouTube channel. So if you know anyone that wasn't able to come, please feel free to let them know they can still watch it. Oh, wait, hang on. There's lots of thank yous in the chat, but no more questions. Okay, so let's leave it here and say good night and thank you.
Thank you, Amy, and good night, everybody. I hope you enjoyed and have a nice rest of your evening.